Well, thank you so much for that embarrassing introduction, Terry. It was really awesome. And thank you all for coming here tonight. This is an incredible place to be talking. It was so thrilling to walk up here. It wasn't so thrilling to see my name out there on the marquee, but to see Kurt Godel's name out there was really thrilling for me. So, I want you to picture this scene. Here's a leafy road. It's in suburban New Jersey. Can't really see them here, but there are stately old homes behind the trees there, and just beyond those elm trees there's a lush green carpet of a country club, a golf course, and muted voices of men knocking at balls are coming as if from a great distance. And picture two men strolling down this quiet street, quietly conversing in German. One an older man and one younger, and deep in conversation. It's not unusual right now at the time frame that we're talking about, which is in the 1940s, to hear German and Hungarian and Polish and Russian being spoken on this street. This street is actually in Princeton, New Jersey, and it's the home not only of a great university, but of the newly established in these days, in the 1940s, Institute for Advanced Study. So there's a sign for it, Institute for Advanced Study. And here in the 1940s that we're imagining ourselves in now, it's only just recently moved from its home in Princeton University, in this old Gothic building. And here's a newspaper clipping and talks about the intellectual paradise that the Institute for Advanced Study is supposed to be. It's just moved from the university campus, from this building, which is actually the old physics building where Einstein had worked, to its own independent campus. This is Fold Hall, part of the Institute for Advanced Study now. And the reason now that we're imagining ourselves in the 1940s, the reason that Princeton, New Jersey is so filled with people speaking German and Hungarian and other languages is that many people, many of the scholars, are fleeing scenes like this. This is actually a scene from the University of Vienna. One of the people that I'm going to be talking about in a moment has just left this. Don't know if you can see, where is my laser's not working. All right, but you can sort of make out the lecturer. He's up front there. He's giving the Nazi salute. All of the students are giving the Nazi salute. And so many scholars, scientists, mathematicians are fleeing scenes like this. In fact, one educator said, "Hitler shakes the tree and I gather the apples." And two of the choicest apples are walking down that road right now, right? Here they are up close. You, of course, recognize the older gentleman, who's none other than Princeton's most famous inhabitant at this time, the man who, even while he's still alive, has been immortalized as the genius, as the apotheosis of the man of genius. And in fact, the townspeople have taken to calling this new institute, the Institute for Advanced Study, the Einstein Institute. But who's the younger guy there? These two men walk back and forth from the institute to the town every day. They walk home together every day, and other people watch them and wonder what it is that they talk about. They're always deep in conversation in all sorts of weather. Here they are in the winter. In fact, Einstein said, I only go to my office, so this is in German, here it is in English, to have the privilege of being able to walk home with Gödel, with Kurt Godel. He said, my own work at this late stage in my life no longer means very much to me, and I only go every day to my office at the Institute in order to have the privilege of walking home with Gödel. So Kurt Godel, obviously, is the name of that younger man. And it's in the remote nature, both of the man and of his work, that he wasn't then, and he still isn't as famous as his walking partner, Albert Einstein. But in his own way, as I want to tell you a little bit about it today, his work was very revolutionary. I don't know if I want to say just as revolutionary, but it was very revolutionary, shaking up the very foundations of his field, which wasn't physics, but mathematics. In fact, Time magazine, when it was the new century, the new millennium, had a roundup of the 100 most important thinkers, artists, men and women of the last century, and Kurt Godel made it to the cut, to the 100 most important scientists and thinkers. And I wanted to read what they wrote about him. Kurt Godel, he turned the lens of mathematics on itself, and we're going to talk about what that means, the extraordinary thing that he did in turning the lens of mathematics on itself, and hit upon his famous incompleteness theorems, driving a stake through the heart of formalism. Very dramatic, and we're going to talk about what that meant, what formalism was, and what did Gödel do to this. Of course, so you know, he's quite famous, but of course his friend Einstein, Time magazine had him as the person of the century, the most important person of the whole century. Albert Einstein, person of the century. He was the iconic 20th century scientist, the bumbling professor with the German accent, a common cliche in 1,000 films, instantly recognizable, like Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp. Who writes this stuff? I don't know. Albert Einstein's shaggy-haired visage was as familiar to ordinary people as to the matrons who fluttered about him in salons from Berlin to Hollywood. Yet he was unfathomably profound, the genius among geniuses who discovered merely by thinking about it that the universe was not as it seemed. In fact, actually, one of the stories is that one of those matrons, one of the women of Princeton, when she recognized the beautiful old face that she saw walking down that road, lost control of her car and rammed it into a tree. So, so Einstein, you know, clearly is you know, the most important, the most famous man of the thinker of that last century. And Einstein, as I said, would only go to his office to walk home with Gödel. I wanted to read an honorary doctorate that Gödel had gotten in 1952 from Harvard. Discoverer of the most significant mathematical truth of this century, incomprehensible to laymen, revolutionary for philosophers and logicians. I'm going to try to convince you that Harvard lies, right? That it's not entirely incomprehensible to laymen, even though, as you can see, the insignia there of Harvard, Veritas, Truth. I think this is not true. I think that, in fact, it can be made comprehensible to laymen, and maybe even in the short time that we have here. So what is it that he did, Kurt Godel? In 1930, when he was 23 years old, here he is as a young man, he had proved an extraordinary thing. He had produced an extraordinary proof in a branch of mathematics that wasn't even considered altogether respectable in his day. He actually made it respectable. Mathematical logic for something called the incompleteness theorem. In fact, it's actually two. There are two incompleteness theorems, two logically related incompleteness theorems. One of the wonderful things is that, unlike most mathematical results, Gödel's incompleteness theorems can be expressed in normal words in English without any mathematical symbols at all. The The nitty-gritty of the details of the proof are very technical, are formidably technical. But happily, delightfully, the overall strategy of the proof is not. It's very elegant, and it's ingenious, and it's simple. I'm going to give it to you today, more or less. And also, it can be spoken in English. In fact, so here is, it's not going to sound like real English to you, but by the end of the talk, you're going to understand. This is from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on Kurt Godel, and it opens up with a very terse, a very crisp statement of his two theorems that I'm going to read to you. By Gödel's theorem, the following statement is generally meant. Now, just notice there's not going to be any symbolism here. It's English, more or less. In any formal system adequate for number theory, there exists an undecidable formula. That is a formula that is not provable and whose negation is not provable. This statement is occasionally referred to as Gödel's first theorem. A corollary to the theorem is that the consistency of a formal system adequate for number theory cannot be proved within the system. And sometimes this corollary is referred to as either Gödel's theorem or as the second theorem. These statements are somewhat vaguely, this is still from the article, these statements are somewhat vaguely formulated generalizations of results published in 1931 by Kurt Godel, then in Vienna. And this is the title of the article that he wrote on formally undecidable sentences of Principia Mathematica and other systems of type 1, which was received for publication November 17th, 1930. Even though you might not guess from this short, terse statement, I'm sure incomprehensible at this point, even though there are no symbols, even though you might not guess it from this terse statement of these incompleteness theorems, the incompleteness theorems are extraordinary for, among other reasons, for how much they have to say. They are probably the most talkative mathematical theorems in the history of mathematics. They go on and on and on. There is so much that one can get out of these theorems. As I had mentioned, they belong to a branch of mathematics known as formal logic. We're going to talk about that in a moment, or mathematical logic. And yet, his theorems range far beyond formal logic, this formal, narrow domain, addressing such large and vast and messy questions as the nature of truth and knowledge and certainty in general. And because our human nature is intimately involved in these discussions of these issues of truth and knowledge and certainty, after all, in speaking of knowledge, we're speaking about knowers, about thinkers, us, right? Gödel's theorems have also seemed to have important things to say about what our minds could or maybe could not be. So Gödel's theorems are unusual, not only because they're rendered in more or less plain English. We use terms like formal systems, consistency, incompleteness. These are technical terms, and we'll talk about what they mean, but they're not symbolic, right? Because these are very rare mathematical creatures, not only because we can avoid symbolism in talking about them, but because, even more interestingly, they seem to address themselves, however ambiguously and controversially, and very controversially, to the central question of the humanities. What is it that's involved in our being human? What is it for us to have knowledge? How can we have knowledge? So I mentioned they're the most talkative theorems in the history of mathematics. There's disagreement about what they say, how much they say, precisely what they're saying, but there's no doubt that they're saying an awful lot beyond mathematics. certainly extending into what we call meta-mathematics, and I'll explain that term in a moment. And perhaps even beyond that, even beyond meta-mathematics. Gödel's theorems are so unusual because they're mathematical theorems that seem to escape the limits of mathematics. They seem to speak both from inside and outside mathematics. They have the precision of mathematics and the reach of philosophy, so you could understand why philosophers find them so fascinating. I use that term meta-mathematics, and I should explain it. This prefix, meta, comes from the Greek, and it means after, beyond, and it suggests the view from outside, as it were. All sorts of different cognitive fields present meta-questions. Questions such as, how is it possible for this area of knowledge to be doing what it's doing? So we can ask meta-questions of science, we can ask meta-questions of art, we can ask meta-questions of mathematics. Mathematics is a field of knowledge which is in many very important respects unique. And so it presents very pointed, very special meta-questions, questions about what it is that we are doing when we're doing mathematics, and how is it possible that we're doing it. The rigor and the certainty of mathematics is arrived at a priori. Whoops, I skipped ahead. A priori, I should have had a slide up there. I thought I did, saying what a priori is. And what it means, basically, a priori, is that we know these truths somehow independent of experience. It doesn't mean that we're born knowing them. It doesn't mean that they're innate. But it means that no experience is going to count against them. So in some sense, their status is independent of experience. So for example, 5 plus 7 equals 12. What would happen if I were to count 5 things and 7 things and not get 12 things, get 13? If that were going to happen, if that should happen, and actually it has happened to me, well, what would I do? I would recount. If I still got 13, if I continued to get 13, would I say that 5 plus 7 equals 12 had been invalidated, had been falsified? No. I would say either it doubled, something doubled, or I'm seeing double, maybe something is wrong with me, maybe I'm dreaming, right? I would go, perhaps that is possible. Or even if I continued to convince myself that all was well and I was awake, even that I was going mad, right? This is something of what we mean when we say that 5 plus 7 equals 12, and in fact, all the truths of mathematics are a priori. This truth is used to evaluate our experiences of counting and not the other way around, right? We don't evaluate the truths of mathematics by our experiences. Somehow, these truths stand outside of experience. They are a priori. So mathematics, just because it's unique, using a priori methods to establish its often astounding, even though certain and incorrigible results, has always forcefully presented theorists of knowledge, those who study knowledge, who are known as epistemologists. That's an epistemologist. And epistemologists think about thinking, right? The mathematics has always presented epistemologists with very special questions. How can the likes of us, who are thrown up by the random thrashings of evolution, attain any sort of infallibility, which we seem to do in mathematics, any sort of certainty? How can we know things a priori. And to grasp this riddle, it might help to think about Marx. Only not that Marx. That Marx, right? Who said that he wouldn't belong to any country club that would accept the likes of him. Well, similarly, some have fretted that if mathematics is really so certain, how can it be known by the likes of us? How could we have gained entry into so restricted a cognitive country club? These are meta-questions, meta-mathematical questions. Meta-questions about a field, say about science or mathematics or the law, all of which raise meta-questions, are not normally questions that are contained in the field itself. So a meta-question of science is not itself a scientific question. Meta-questions in law are not something that can be answered through the methodology of the law. Rather, they're philosophical questions. That's the domain of philosophy. Philosophy of science, philosophy of the law, philosophy of math. Gödel's theorems are spectacular exceptions to this general rule. These are mathematically proved theorems, a priori proved theorems. After all, this is a piece of mathematics, and yet they establish a meta-conclusion. It's as if, so he's addressing, within mathematics itself, he's addressing meta-mathematical questions. And this is amazing. This is unique in the history, up until then, of mathematics. It's as if someone had painted a picture that manages to address the basic questions of art. What is it to be beautiful in art? And maybe even answer how it is and why it is that art is able to move us the way it does. This is the closest I could come, an Escher picture, to a question that seems to get out of the framework and to address the question of art itself. Gödel's theorems say something about the limits of proof, the limits of formal systems. Use this term, we'll explain it in a moment. What the first theorem states is that all formal systems are either inconsistent or incomplete. All formal systems that are rich enough to express arithmetic. So you have a choice with formal systems, either inconsistency or incompleteness. Take your pick. You can't have both. You can't have a formal system that is complete and that's consistent. So I've used three technical terms here: formal systems, consistency, completeness. And now it's time for me to explain them. Let's talk about formal systems first. These are big semesters worth of ideas, right? So I hope to give you only enough understanding so that you grasp the extraordinary thing that Kurt Godel did with these theorems. Formal system is basically a system in which everything is done by rules. It's systematized rules. There is nothing that is not done by rules in a formal system. It's all a kind of mechanical procedure, the sort of thing that could be programmed into a computer. Formal system basically has three sorts of rules. The first sort specifies just what's the alphabet of the symbols. What are the symbols that are used in the formal system? What are the symbols that can be used, that can appear in the formal system? The second sort specifies how these symbols can be combined with one another. What is a meaningful way, according to the rules, of combining these symbols into what we call well-formed formulas? And the third sort of rule tells you which combinations of symbols follow from which combinations of symbols, right? So it's all very rule-oriented, three types of rules. What are the symbols? How can they be combined? What symbols follow from what symbols? What combination of symbols follow from what combinations of symbols? These rules of a formal system go as far as defining what the symbols and what the well-formed formulas mean in the formal system. The way that we put this in mathematical logic or in philosophy is that in a formal system, meaning is all syntactical. It all has to do with the rules of the grammar of the system. 3 types of grammatical rules that I've just given you there. It's a matter of rules and nothing but rules. So, very abstract talk. Here's an example. Here's a symbol, right? You think you know what it means, right? You have a and, right? You think this ampersand means and. Here in a formal system are the rules that define the meaning of this term, right? And this term means nothing over and above these rules. Here's one rule. If you've got P, sign, ampersand, Q, you can deduce P, right? So this is, if you've got P, ampersand, Q, you can deduce Q. If you've got P, and you've got Q, what can you deduce? P and Q, right? And these are the syntactical rules that completely exhaust what that symbol and means in a formal system. And that's what a formal system is. Everything is done by rules. You don't ask outside of the rules, what does it all mean? So a formal system has no meaning outside of the rules that constitute it. Formal systems run, computers run by formal systems. And here's a joke, sort of, a comic that's supposed to get the idea of a formal system, that computers are restricted to formal systems. I think, therefore I am. He comes to some sort of meaning here. I am, I think, therefore I am alive with life and thought and mind, sweet consciousness and immortal soul. Formal systems, this can't happen in formal systems, right? Formal systems are used to prove theorems. What Gödel's first incompleteness theorem says is that all formal systems that are rich enough to express arithmetic, very basic mathematics, are either inconsistent or incomplete. And we're going to talk about what that means in a moment. The whole reason for formal systems is to produce proofs in a very mechanical fashion. Why they're so important in proofs, whether they're so important for proofs, whether proof comes down to nothing but proving in a formal system, this is the meta question that lies at the heart of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. It's actually the meta question motivating the whole Gödel incompleteness issue. What the whole issue was about was whether or not all of mathematics can be reduced to the sort of mechanical procedures that we do in formal systems. So remember the slide that we saw from Time Magazine's 100. Do I have it? Yes, here we are. Kurt Godel, he turned the lens of mathematics on itself and hit upon the famous incompleteness theorems, driving a stake through the heart of formalism. Formalism is the view that all of mathematics can be reduced to formal systems. That great mystery of how can the likes of us get into this restricted country club? How can the likes of us attain such incorrigible, infallible knowledge? What formalism tried to say is that we create these formal systems. It's kind of a game that we play, and we carry out the implications, the entailments of this formal system. How do we get these intuitions? Where do they come from? We're finite creatures. How can the likes of us know about infinity such that no empirical evidence would count against it. You would call somebody, I would rather say I was insane than that I had some sort of experience that falsified 5 plus 7 equals 12. How does this happen? It's all a matter of formal systems. There's really nothing very mysterious about it. For example, we know that every natural number has a successor, right? We're never going to run out of natural numbers. We know that there is an infinite number of prime numbers. We have a proof of that. We're never going to get to the highest prime number. How can we, who are so small and finite, and how do I know up there beyond any number that we've counted to, there isn't some highest prime number? How can I know this? How can we attain this kind of infinite knowledge? This is this great meta-mathematical question. And the fact that we could have some sort of intuitions of it, if somehow that we finite creatures can have these intuitions of infinity, can sound like a kind of mysticism, right? That we can somehow attain to this knowledge of infinity, that we have intuitions of it, that somehow we see it in a way akin to sense perception. The idea that that's what mathematics is, which is opposed to formalism. Formalism is opposed to this idea of some kind of mystical insight into an extra sensible, extra physical world, somewhat seemingly mystical idea. The thinker with whom this idea that there really are independent mathematical truths and the mathematician is discovering them, not inventing them in formal systems, but discovering them, is most associated with this thinker. He's the point of view opposed to formalism is known as Platonism, and here's the first Platonist, none other than good old Plato, who lived in the 5th century BC. Formalism is the attempt to nip this kind of mystico-mathematical view of Platonism in the bud. Formalism wanted to banish the whole idea of intuitions from mathematics. According to formalism, all of mathematics is just a matter of rules. It's formal systems, right? It's those 3 kinds of rules, the kind of thing we can program into computers. We make up our rules, and then we follow them, and we see what they lead to. In formalism's telling, mathematics becomes chess raised to a sort of higher order of intricacy. There is, all of us would agree, no objective chess, no objective world of chess, some reality that the system of chess captures. In chess, the stipulated rules constitute the whole truth of chess. Similarly, according to formalism, which is most associated with this man, David Hilbert, who was the most important mathematician of the generation prior to Gödel's. According to formalism and Hilbert, the stipulated rules of a formal system constitute the whole truth of mathematics. Away with all of this mysticism, this intuition, this super sensible reality of Plato. Mathematics is a game, and we win in mathematics by proving theorems. That is, by showing some uninterpreted string of symbols follows from some other uninterpreted string of symbols using the agreed upon rules of inference. And we don't bring in any extra meanings. The rules provide all the meaning. There's no external truth against which mathematics has to measure itself. Mathematics is not, contra Plato, describing some trans-empirical reality. All of mathematics can be reduced to formal systems which are consistent and complete. Okay, so you have a feel for what formal systems are, more or less, and what formalism was. Now for these other terms, complete. What does that mean? So formalism needs that all of mathematics can be reduced to formal systems that are consistent and that are complete. What does complete mean? A formal system is complete if basically you can prove everything in it that you want to prove in it. Given any well-formed formula, anything you can express in that system, you can show that either it or its negation are provable, that there are no undecidable propositions within it, propositions that can't be proved true and can't be proved false. And then inconsistent, you probably know what that means, but we'll go, what does it mean? A formal system is inconsistent if you can prove a contradiction in it. If you can derive within that system, using the rules of that system, both P and not P, for some proposition P. P and not P. This is very, very bad. Very bad. You do not want this. We can live with incompleteness in our formal systems. We're living with it. We have to live with it ever since Gödel. We can't live with inconsistency in a formal system. What's so wrong with inconsistency in a formal system? Well, I'll tell you what's so wrong. It's just that it makes the entire system completely worthless, right? Throw it away. It's worthless. An inconsistent system is one in which you can prove a contradiction. And from a contradiction, we can prove formally, from a contradiction, anything at all follows. Any stupid proposition you could throw at me, anything, right, can be proved from a contradiction. If you have a contradiction, anything follows from it. So as the whole point of formal systems is to prove. If it's an inconsistent system, that makes it way too easy. You can prove anything, any worthless string of not nonsense. It has to be meaningful within the system, but you can prove anything from a contradiction. So an inconsistent system is too complete, right? It can prove anything that it can express. Nothing ruins a system like inconsistency. You don't want inconsistency. So now already, despite what Harvard said in awarding Gödel his honorary doctorate, we're beginning to see what Gödel did and why it's so metamathematically important. Why it was that he drove a stake in the heart of formalism. Formalism claimed that mathematics is nothing but formal systems. Formal systems which are, of course, consistent. We're only interested in consistent systems. Inconsistent systems, don't want those. Formalism claimed, for example, that a field like arithmetic can be reduced to a formal system. That's what it means for it to be true, provable in a formal system. There is, it claimed, a consistent formal system of arithmetic. Formalism claims this, that contained all the truths of arithmetic. And here's what Gödel's first incompleteness theorem states. No formal system of arithmetic is both consistent and complete. For any formal system rich enough to express arithmetic, this is not his language but mine, there can be shown to be arithmetical truths which are not provable within that system. Notice he says truths. We can actually see that these propositions are true, but they're not derivable within that system. You can add them as an axiom to make your system bigger, but then Gödel shows you a way of constructing another proposition which we can see is true, but isn't provable within that system. So you can already see why he's making trouble for formalism. And his second incompleteness theorem claimed that the consistency of a formal system cannot be proved, rich enough to express arithmetic, I have to say, cannot be proved within that system. So when we're using a system, we can't, unless we go out of that system and provide an interpretation of talk about what that system is talking about in a way that formalism doesn't want, right? The way that kind of pulls the plug on formalism. if we stay within the formal system, if we talk about nothing but the formal system, we can't even prove that that system is consistent. It may be one of those horrific, inconsistent systems that we're operating within. This is very, very bad for formalism, right? All right. And who did this? There he is, actually. It's one of my favorite pictures of him. Here he is, sometime in Vienna, in his hiking clothes. Any of you who have spent time in Austria know all the Austrians go hiking all the time. And there's Gödel. What motivated Gödel? And he did this sometime before he was 23. Gödel, no surprise, Gödel was a Platonist. In fact, he was a passionate Platonist. He apparently became one when he was very young, as a young undergraduate at the University of Vienna. He actually entered the University of Vienna intending to study physics. He was always most interested in learning about reality, the nature of reality. That was always his burning motivation. Just like the man who would become his best friend many years later on the other side of the world, both of them refugees from the madness of Nazism in New Jersey. But sometime as an undergraduate, think about this, as an undergraduate, sometime in the 1920s, he took an introductory course in philosophy with a Professor Gumperz, Heinrich Gumperz. Years later in New Jersey, many, many years later, after Einstein had died and Gödel, who really had only wanted to talk to Einstein, and once Einstein died, he retreated more and more into his own private world and became, unfortunately, he had always been somewhat paranoid, but he became even more paranoid, something of a recluse. A sociologist named Burke Grandjean, who had been trying to interview Kurt Godel for a long time, and Gödel didn't answer him. Finally, out of frustration, the sociologist sent Kurt Godel a questionnaire, and he asked him all sorts of questions, wanting to know, among other things, who were the most important influences on Gödel? Who were the philosophical influences on Gödel? And the sociologist listed a bunch of philosophers to make it easy for Gödel. All he had to do was put a check or an X, and asked him just to say, which of these. And Gödel made this out. In fact, he made it out twice. He didn't send it off the first time. Grandjean sent it to him a second time. How do I know all this? Because like so much else in the Gödel remains, in the Nachlass, the archives, he never sent it off, right? It's all down there in the archives of Princeton University, right? And so, along with all sorts of other things, is slips from books he took out as an undergraduate, deliveries of coal from Vienna. He saved everything. And there, I found this questionnaire from Grandjean. Gödel listed just 3 philosophers as having influenced him. He seemed, by the way, to take particular offense at one of the philosophers that Grandjean had offered as perhaps being a great influence on Gödel, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And in this questionnaire that Gödel did not send off, but which I was fortunate enough to find down there, Gödel actually acts a little offended and says, Wittgenstein had nothing to do with my ideas in metamathematics. In fact, he never understood my proofs, and if he did, he wouldn't have said the things he did. So he really took offense at this. The 3 philosophers he listed were Plato, Leibniz. He had a very, very close relationship with Leibniz. As a matter of fact, after Einstein died and Gödel seemed to be not really talking to any of his contemporaries, it seemed like his closest colleague was Leibniz. And Professor Gomperz. He lists Professor Gomperz. I couldn't find a picture of Gomperz, but I found this little sketch of him. That these were the 3 philosophers who had most influenced him, and he said that he took an introductory course in philosophy with Professor Gompertz. Professor Gompertz's father had been, Theodore Gompertz, had been a famous, or a historian of ancient philosophy. There are 3 books he wrote on ancient philosophy. And why did Gödel list Professor Gompertz as being such an important influence on him? Apparently, while he was a student in this introductory course, Gödel's life was more or less changed. He more or less became galvanized by these ideas of Plato, with this fundamental idea in Plato that this spatiotemporal world that we experience is really a projection out of an abstract manifold, a level of reality that's graspable only through reason, in the way that we grasp mathematics, and that's as real, but actually even more real than the spatiotemporal world that it explains. In fact, that the spatiotemporal world enjoys whatever reality it does because of the participation in this more abstract reality. It's the essence of Plato, and Gödel seemed, while an undergraduate, to have become passionately interested and devoted to this idea. He told another logician, How Wang, many years later, that under this influence, he changed his major from physics to mathematics. That for him, mathematics now became a way of discovering reality. He was very committed to the view that mathematics is not an invention, but a discovery. He's a Platonist, he's not a formalist. He first went into number theory, he said. That's where he first thought that he would find some kind of truths that would reflect on this mathematical reality. So here's a funny thing about Gödel. He went into the math for the philosophy. That's what he was interested in. He wanted mathematical results that would somehow be able to reflect on the interpretation of mathematics in general. And he knew which interpretation he was looking for, which meta-mathematical view he was looking for, Platonism. So this was his motivation. He wanted to show that arithmetic was about numbers, right? That set theory was about sets, that it was about things, outside of the formal system, that it was about things. He wanted to show that there was a Platonic sphere of abstract entities that constituted what we call the models for our formal systems, and that our formal systems are true to the extent that they truly describe the entities of their intended models. This gives one a glimpse into the really outsized ambitions of this rather strange undergraduate at the University of Vienna. There he is. Who was outwardly, almost interestingly, almost absurdly timid and cautious, who was in his outward life prey to all sorts of absurd, unfortunately, fears, sometimes darkened into genuine paranoia of such intensity that he would sometimes have to be hospitalized. Here's an asylum, even in Austria, where he suffered these bouts of extreme paranoia. But who, let's get off of this bad picture. I don't like this picture. We'll stay here with Hilbert. But who, although outwardly cautious, fearful, paranoid, insofar as his intellectual ambitions went and his intuitions went, he was fearless. He was a kind of hero. He had such a heroic confidence and intuitions. It's a truly audacious ambition for an undergraduate who's bothered by meta-mathematical questions and who learns of Plato in an introductory course from Professor Gompertz to assign himself the task of discovering a mathematical conclusion that would simultaneously be a meta-mathematical result that would support mathematical realism, Platonism, that mathematics is about something. And it was even more, and this is amazing enough, but if you actually look at the historical context in which he was then living, it's even more astounding that he had this ambition, this point of view, because this was completely out of fashion at the time. Formalism was the reigning school of metamathematics, with the most influential mathematician of the day, David Hilbert, behind formalism. And why was formalism so popular just then? Well, first of all, there's the spooky aspect, right? This whole commitment to an extra sensible world, this Platonic world, a world of abstract objects. There's always a reason to try to eliminate that. Occam's razor, right? You try to get rid of all extraneous ontological I'm using those words that philosophers use. Ontological commitments about what exists. But also remember that formalism was trying to banish intuitions from mathematics. Intuitions, when you just know that something is true, right? It's that gut feeling, you know it's true even though you can't prove it. You know it and you know it with certainty. And there are always good reasons for people to be suspicious of intuitions, right? People claim to have intuitions about all sorts of things. Often one person has an intuition for P and another person has an intuition for not P. Sometimes people are so certain of their intuitions that they wage holy wars in support of their intuition. So even outside of mathematics, there's always a reason to be suspicious of these intuitions, right? These intuitions of certainty, but in mathematics as well. And the late 19th century, the early 20th century, had some very dramatic evidence of the shakiness of our mathematical intuitions, with the discovery of, first of all, non-Euclidean geometry, and also with the discovery of what we call the paradoxes of set theory. There were several discoveries of paradox right within set theory, right there within mathematics. And I'm going to tell you about one of them. There's Cantor's paradox of the set of all sets that can't exist. I'm going to tell you about one really serious paradox of set theory known as Russell's paradox. It was discovered by formalized mathematics, starting with axioms, definitions, deriving everything from there. There's Kurt Gödel. There's somebody I haven't mentioned right next to Gödel. That's Hans Hahn, who was Kurt Gödel's, those of you who are mathematicians know of Hahn, the famous Banach-Hahn theorem, that Hahn was Gödel's dissertation advisor, and he had no idea, interestingly enough, what this young man was cooking up, right? He had no idea until Gödel announced very quietly that he had proved the first incompleteness theorem, that he had derived a proposition that we could see is true, but is unprovable within the formal system of arithmetic. Hahn had no idea what Gödel was up to. So there's Hahn, there's Hilbert, there's Bertrand Russell. So here's the set of all mathematicians mentioned in my talk today. So you can also have properties of sets. And you can ask, so sometimes sets can be members of other sets, right? So I can ask, for example, of this set of all mathematicians, whether it's a member of itself. Is the set of all mathematicians a member of itself? Clearly it's not a member of itself, because the set of all mathematicians is not a mathematician. It's a set, right? But the set of all, say, mathematical constructions, is that set of a member of itself? Yes, because the set of all mathematical constructions is itself a mathematical construction, so is a member of itself. So let's think about this particular property of sets not being a member of itself. There's a property, holds of sets, all sets which are not members of themselves. And we're going to form this set. The set which has as its members all the sets which aren't members of itself. All right? It's that set. It's a perfectly good description. I've explained it to you. Let's form the set. Is it a member of itself? Is the set of all sets that aren't members of itself a member of itself? Either it is or it isn't. That's just logic, folks. Well, if it is a member of itself, then it's not a member of itself, because this set contains only sets that aren't members of itself. So if it's a member of itself, it's not a member of itself. Okay, so it's not a member of itself. But if it's not a member of itself, then it's a member of itself, because this set contains all the sets that aren't members of itself. Right? So this set is a member of itself. It's a member of itself, and it's not a member of itself. The set of all sets that aren't members of themselves both is and isn't a member of itself. Contradiction, right? We don't want contradictions, right? This is the promise, right? We don't want contradictions. So this was the fact that we can form this set in set theory. That set theory, as it then existed, was able to produce a contradiction was pretty damn bad. The set of all sets that aren't members of themselves, it doesn't exist. It can't exist. We know it can't exist because it produces contradictions. But we have the intuition. Wherever you have a description, you can form the set. Here's proof. Intuitions can go awry. Intuitions are not altogether reliable, even in mathematics, let alone in ethics or in politics or all the other places, religion, all the other places that people claim intuitions. Even in mathematics, our most exact science, intuitions can go awry. Hilbert was very upset by this, the formation of, as you can imagine, right, of the paradoxes within set theory. And here's a quote from him. Admittedly, the present state of affairs where we run up against the paradoxes is intolerable. Just think, the definitions and deductive methods which everyone learns, teaches, and uses in mathematics lead to absurdities. If mathematical thinking is defective, where are we to find truth and certitude? This comes from David Hilbert, an article on the infinite. The most important thing is to show that our formal systems are consistent, that they can prove any contradictions, because as I've already explained to you, a formal system that's inconsistent is worthless. You can prove anything in it. It's too complete. So Hilbert told his cadre of mathematicians in a pep talk that he gave them in 1900 that they must go out and prove forthwith, immediately, the consistency of arithmetic. Hilbert himself had already shown that geometry was conditionally consistent, meaning what he had shown is that geometry is consistent if arithmetic is. It was conditional on proving the consistency of the formal system of arithmetic. And this is why, of course, he urged his mathematicians to go out and prove the consistency of enter Gödel. There he is. That's mean. But Hilbert's program was to formalize everything, get rid of those sketchy intuitions, show that we don't need them, all depended on being able to formalize arithmetic, to show that arithmetic, their formal system that could express arithmetic, was both complete and consistent. And Gödel showed that this was impossible, and he showed even further that with his second incompleteness theorem, that we can't even within the system of arithmetic ever prove the consistency of that system. We have to go out and provide what we call a model for it, show that it's about something. So he delivers a double stake in the heart of formalism, just as the Time magazine said. It's a double stake, actually. Where did I get this? All right, what I wanted to do was show you just a little bit. It's such a beautiful, beautiful proof. I obviously can't, get into it here. It's quite short. It's very, very dense. Tremendous amount packed into it. In fact, a lot of mathematics, the whole notion of a recursive function and recursion theory, model theory, came out of what Gödel did in that proof. And in fact, in trying to show the limitations of a formal system, he sharpened the notion of a formal system beyond any measures that it had been gone to before. So he really made the notion of a formal system much clearer in trying to show its limitations in mathematics. But I wanted to give you, just in these brief last minutes, a little feel for what he does here, this ingenious proof, which is just so beautiful. It's all worked out extraordinary. It's fantastic. What he manages to do through this amazing detailed work, something that we now call Gödel numbering, though of course modest Gödel would never have called it by his own name, is that he gets arithmetical statements to kind of talk about themselves. There's a kind of double speak going on. So that these propositions have both a straightforward arithmetical meaning. They say something about the relationship of numbers, right? It's just natural numbers. But they're also talking about themselves at the same time. They're talking about their own provability, whether they can be proved in the system or not. They're saying something arithmetical, and they're saying something metamathematical, something extra formula, something about themselves and their own provability. It's all worked out extraordinarily, carefully, beautifully. It's kind of heart-stoppingly beautiful. And here's what he comes up with. It is an arithmetical statement that's both saying something about numbers, and it's also saying that it itself is not provable. It's the self-referential stuff, right, that we saw with the set of all sets. Is it a member of itself? Gödel tells us, in trying to give us a little help, heuristic help, in understanding this proof, which was very unlike any proof that had come before, he tells us to compare it to this statement, P. This very sentence is false. That's this sentence. The P is this sentence. It is saying that it itself is false. This is known, it's an ancient paradox. It's known as the liar's paradox. So what's wrong with this sentence? I bet you can already see. Is this sentence true? Is P true? Well, if P is true, then P is false. Right? Okay, so it's false. Well, if it's false, then it's true, right? Because that's what it says. So P is both true and false. I mean, it is this self-referential paradox. Gödel's strange arithmetical proposition says something analogous in its doublespeak. He cooks up a proposition in his system that says something arithmetical, but it also says, G says, that G is this very proposition, and it says that G is unprovable in the system. So here is an arithmetical sentence through the magic, and it feels like magic, believe me, in the proof, but it's not. It's a proof, it all works. Through that cunning of the proof, this proposition, which is a straight, very strange arithmetical proposition, is also saying about itself that it is unprovable in the system. The negation of G is that G is provable in the system, right? Because G says it's not provable in the system. So what not G says, the negation of G, is that G is provable in the system. Is G provable in the system? If G is provable, then its negation, not G, which after all says that G is provable in the system, would be true. So if G is provable in the system, its negation is true. Get it? But if the negation of a proposition is true, then the proposition itself is false, right? P or not P. So if G is provable in the system, then it's false. But if G is provable in the system, then it's also true if the system is consistent, right? So that is a condition of this whole proof. If the system is consistent, then it's incomplete. So we're assuming the consistency of this system. So if G is provable, then G is both true and false, right? If the system is consistent. After all, what does a proof show? Assuming, of course, the system is consistent, then that approved proposition is true. So assuming the consistency of the system, if G is provable, then it's both true and false. What do we conclude from this? That's a contradiction. Therefore, G is not provable. We've just proved that G is not provable, right? We've proved, and because that's exactly what G says, that G is not provable is exactly what G says. Therefore, G is true, but not provable. Get it? He's proved, here's it, right, it's amazing. Therefore, G is both unprovable and true, which is precisely what the famous conclusion of Gödel's proof says, that there is a true but unprovable proposition expressible in the system if the system is complete, is consistent. And because G also has a straightforwardly arithmetical meaning, which of course is true if G is true, because it is G, Gödel's proof shows that there are arithmetical truths, for example, G, that can't be proved within the formal system, assuming the system to be consistent, right? The formal system is either inconsistent or incomplete. That's the first incompleteness theorem. Well, anyway, we've done something very important. We've proven Harvard wrong, right? You all understand. You're laymen, you all understand, right? Basically what happened here, and I just want to end with this Baron Munchausen and Kurt Godel, the poet, this isn't my idea, a poet, Enzensberger, compared Gödel's argument with the tale about Baron Munchausen, famous liar, children's story. And one of the stories of him is he manages to heave himself and his horse out of a swamp by pulling on his own ponytail, right? And this wonderful poet who also tried to see Gödel, I found that letter in the Nathos, also compares what Gödel does here within the formal system, proving this metamathematical result of the limits of the formal system within the formal system, kind of compares it to this tall tale of Baron Munchausen. But the thing is that Baron Munchausen was a liar, and Kurt Godel had a proof. So, thank you very much.
Is the fact that 0 times 1 is equal to 0, but yet 0 divided, or 1 divided by 0, which is the same thing as 0 times 1, is undefined, is that also an example of Gödel?
I don't think so. That actually, the truths that you're mentioning here really follow from the rules of arithmetic, right? I mean, it really is completely within arithmetic, following from the basic rules that we use, the axioms, of arithmetic. Arithmetic has been axiomatized, right? And so that's a kind of really arithmetical. It's within the system of arithmetic. It doesn't have that strange kind of inside-outside feature of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. That is really arithmetical. It's not metamathematical. Maybe you're seeing something. It seems, there are many things that we deduce within mathematics that seem strange and paradoxical. So that many of the results that we come to I mean, the whole notion of an irrational number, that the Greeks had is in some sense a strange, and in fact, the classifications, the way that these new advances in mathematics get named, often register the deep surprise when we deduce certain results within mathematics, right? So we call irrational numbers and imaginary numbers and irrational numbers as opposed to real numbers. That the very classification, I think, registers the kind of historical surprise that when we deduce some of the implications of our arithmetic. But that's a different kind of surprise than this surprise that Gödel delivered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what happens if we take G itself to be an arithmetical axiom, if we decide to assume that instead of trying to prove it?
Excellent question. And that's, of course, the next rational move to do. You just add G, right, as an axiom. And then this goes on ad infinitum. Gödel shows you how you cook up another G for the new system. So no matter how many times you add in your axioms, he's given you a recipe within that system for cooking up something that escapes your formal system. One way of putting this result, as I say, here's the proof. What it actually means, what it's actually showing us metamathematically about mathematics is certainly up for debate. Mathematics is clear, but the interpretation of mathematics is not, right? So that whether or not this really shows, as Gödel thought, as Gödel actually says that he what motivated him and what he actually thought followed from this was mathematical realism, was the fact that mathematics was descriptive, was the uneliminability of intuitions, that when we do mathematics, as bad as and as risky as intuitions are, intuitions can lead us awry, but that they can't be eliminated from mathematics, that we can't just make it a mechanical, formal, purely syntactic procedure. That is certainly the way Gödel interpreted these conclusions. In some sense, what he's telling us is that, mathematics, we can't eliminate the risk, right? That it's risky. We may go terribly awry. We may be using intuitions that are going to lead ultimately to problems, to paradoxes, but that they can't be eliminated. So in some sense, it's interesting sort of saying, that anything, or at least mathematics, I like to universalize it to say anything worth doing is risky, but mathematics as well, that there's a certain amount of risk in it. Formalism was trying to minimize the risk, in fact, eliminate it. Anyway, but that's what happens. If you try to add it, there's a way of cooking up the system so that you can create another G. I think we're on this side.
I have sort of a twofold question. I don't want to open up a can of worms here, but can you give an example of G? Like, is there really a equation or something that really says that it itself is not provable somehow? And then the other thing that I wanted to know was really what is the implications of all this philosophically? Okay, so if math can't prove everything, does that just mean that, okay, we don't know everything, or that we can't prove everything, or what is it that it's really saying about us? Thank you.
Okay, so the G that's actually cooked up here, which we know to be true but unprovable, is a very strange arithmetical proposition, right? I'm not going to, However, Gödel says that these types of true but unprovable proposition are of the following sort. So there is, and he actually mentions a famous, as yet unsolved problem, Goldbach's conjecture. He actually mentions this in the foreword to his proof. So what Goldbach's conjecture is that every even number higher than 2 is the sum of 2 prime numbers. right? And so this mathematician, Goldbach, conjectured this. He doesn't have a proof, right? So that every even number higher than 2 is the sum of 2 prime numbers. We don't have a proof for this, right? Every even number that we've checked so far, but you know what? There are a lot of them. There are an infinite number of them, and we're not going to check them all. Everyone we've checked so far, this is true for. Every even number is the sum of 2 primes. That proposition is either true or false. If it's false, that every even number is a sum of 2 primes, then in principle we could discover that, because somewhere out there in infinity there exists a counterexample. There exists an even number which is not the sum of 2 primes. Prime numbers are numbers that can only be divided by themselves and 1 and by nothing else, right? That you can't, it doesn't have any divisor except itself and 1. And here's an amazing thing. Go home and check it. Right? For every even number, you'll see that you can come up, it's the sum of 2 prime numbers. So if it's false, in principle we could discover that, because we'll keep at it long enough, we'll discover a counterexample. But let's say it's true that every even number is the sum of 2 prime numbers, and yet there is no way to prove it. There's no way to get from our axioms of arithmetic to a proof of this. It just happens to be a fact about numbers, that every even number is the sum of 2 primes. A formalist would say, well, then it just has no truth value. Either it's false, so in principle it's, we can discover it, or if it just doesn't follow from our formal system, if no proof follows, it's not true. It's just, it has no truth value. To Gödel, to a Platonist, look, it's either true or false. Either every even number is the sum of 2 prime numbers, or there exists a counterexample. But that Gödel gives us as a possible, he says that there are true but unprovable propositions of the order of Goldbach's conjecture, and that's, a famous conjecture that we can show are true, but unprovable. So, and what are the implications for this? Well, here are some of the implications that some people, it does seem to follow that mathematics cannot be reduced to formal systems. That does seem to follow. There are still formalists around. There are still people who are formalists, who dance around Gödel's incompleteness theorems one way or the other. But it's become much harder to be a formalist since Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So I wouldn't even say that formalism is, he drove a stake through the heart of formalism. I would say it, but not publicly. But so it's not even, so in terms of meta-mathematics, what follows? Certainly difficulties for formalism. What more follows? So you ask, what Gödel didn't conclude from this that a limitation on mathematical knowledge. He argued from this a limitation on formal systems. So Gödel's way of understanding this is that we have mathematical knowledge that can't be formalized. He wasn't saying that there's mathematics that escapes us. In fact, we actually can see that this proposition is true, although unprovable. In the elegance of that proof that I just gave you, you can see that it's true but unprovable. So Gödel is not saying the incompleteness of mathematics. He's saying the incompleteness of formal systems, right? That our formal systems can't exhaust even all of our mathematical knowledge. Can our mathematical knowledge exhaust all of mathematical reality, given what Gödel says, that there is a mathematical reality? He actually sometimes allows himself to talk about this. There's a famous article called What is Cantor's Continuum Hypothesis, in which he really puts forth his Platonism. And he says, so here's another undecidable, it's too much to explain, but Cantor's continuum hypothesis is another one of these theorems that doesn't follow from set theory. It's a set theoretic Here's what it basically says is, no, I can't do it. I can't do it too. Well, all right, so we have this set. Here's an amazing thing that happened in 19th century mathematics with Cantor, Georg Cantor, fantastic mathematician. He showed that there are orders of infinity. You can have an infinite set, you can have another infinite set that's kind of bigger. I mean, this sounds so paradoxical. This is one of the, these surprising results in mathematics. I mean, infinity is infinity, right, you would think. I remember reading about this when I was a kid. I think this is what got me started in mathematics when I read Gamow's 1, 2, 3 Infinity. I don't know if any of you have read it. Fantastic book, a wonderful book. I mean, you should all read this book. But he talks about these orders of infinity. So there is the set of natural numbers, counting numbers, right? And then there's a set of real numbers, right? The rationals and irrationals, right? And there are more real numbers than there are natural numbers, right? And there's a fantastic argument to show this, that there are actually one infinite set is in some sense bigger than the other, meaning that you can put in one-to-one correspondence, you can pair up every natural number with a real number, and there are going to be real numbers left over. That's what that means. So we have these two sets. We have the natural numbers, we have the set of natural numbers, we have the set of real numbers. And what we want to know is there some set in between that's bigger than the natural numbers and smaller than the real numbers? And that was Cantor's continuum hypothesis, and I think he said that there wasn't, or that there was. I can't remember what the hypothesis was. Either there was one in between or there wasn't. And Gödel, together with the mathematician Paul Kohn, together proved that the continuum hypothesis can't be proved within set theory. Both it and its negation are compatible with the axioms of set theory. But it's either true or false, Gödel says. It's either true or false. It's beyond our mathematical knowledge. We can't get to it from our axioms. And what Gödel says is, eventually, hopefully, we'll have more precise, bigger, more expansive axioms that will allow us to get to it. But maybe not. Maybe we'll never get to it. But it's either true or not. There is either is a set between those two sets or there isn't. So whether he thought that what followed here, is it the limitations of our mathematics? How much mathematics can I know? All that he was really proving was mathematics we know much more than can be contained in formal systems. One more thing that has been, I'm sorry, that's such a good question that you asked to go on like this. One more thing that has been claimed is that, that the fact that our mathematical knowledge is bigger than formal systems, that it can never be contained in formal systems, shows that our minds are not computers, even when we're doing mathematics, much less when we're writing poetry, right, or something like this. But even when we're doing mathematics, right, the most formal thing that we do, our minds cannot be digital computers. This argument was made when Gödel was still alive in 1962 by the English philosopher John Lucas, and it has since been made extremely popular, and it forms the basis of Roger Penrose's, two of Roger Penrose's best-selling works, The Emperor's New Clothes and Shadows of the Mind, in which he argues, he's a real Gödelian Platonist. He completely buys Gödel's argument that Gödel's incompleteness shows the truth of mathematical reality, and he argues that Gödel's incompleteness theorems show something about the mind, that the mind is not a digital computer. The mind is something, when we're doing mathematics, we're doing something beyond a formal system, beyond something that can be programmed into a computer. So all sorts of very large claims have been urged on the basis of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. That's why I say they are the most talkative mathematical results in the history of mathematics. It's not clear what they're saying, but they're saying a lot, right? They're going beyond mathematics. Yes?
First, I want to thank you for your time and your research. But what I was wondering is I was kind of picturing myself on that street, and you have Gödel and you have Einstein talking, and with this theory as I understand it from today. And then I think of Einstein and his theory, my understanding is he was working on kind of like a universal theory, something that would explain everything, and to me that seems contradictory. So I'm wondering what your research might have found about what kind of conversations they might have had in that sense.
Oh, yeah, everybody, yes, thank you for that question. Everybody wonders about this. And I interviewed, when I was writing the book, I interviewed old-timers. I got to them just in time. They all died right after I spoke to them. One in particular, Armand Borel, a mathematician, told me, that he would watch them every day walking back and forth. And he said to me, I can still hear him, they only would talk to each other. They didn't want to talk to anybody else. It was fascinating. And he said, we all wondered, what is it that they talked about? And I speculate in my book very much what it was that they talked about. And here's the interesting thing about both of them. One thing we know that they spoke about was physics. Gödel learned a lot of physics from Einstein, and for his Einstein's 67th birthday, a Festschrift, a sort of celebratory volume, was put together of all scholars writing on Einstein's work, and Gödel contributed something which is so fascinating. It's an interpretation. It's a model of relativity theory in which time is cyclical. Actually, time runs in a loop. You can go back into your past. Gödel was fascinated by this idea, and this is published in this Festschrift. So we know, and all the physicists were amazed at how well Gödel understood physics. Where did he learn it? Well, he learned it from the master. He learned it from Einstein. So one of the things they certainly spoke about there was physics, was relativity theory, was quantum mechanics. You all know Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics. Gödel didn't like quantum mechanics either. And both men were very committed realists. They were both Einstein in physics, Gödel in mathematics and in physics. Gödel was a super realist. They were very committed to the view that their particular fields were descriptive of reality. And interestingly enough, that's a strange view in mathematics, one could say, this sort of extra-sensible, transcendental world, although Gödel made it hard to brush that under the rug after the incompleteness theorems. But in physics, you would think, well, of course, everybody believes that physics is a description of reality, that it's somehow just. But in fact, in Gödel, in Einstein's day, and even in our own day, that's not such a popular view because of paradoxes in quantum mechanics, the measurement problem, all of these problems in quantum mechanics. And both Einstein and Gödel, interestingly enough, felt themselves marginalized in their respective communities, which is really fascinating. So here were the two most important thinkers of their day, right? All who would cause such profound revolutions in their chosen field, so that their field had to reconfigure itself around them, right? Around relativity theory. And Einstein also had a lot to do with the beginnings of his ideas in quantum mechanics as well. He certainly, and in Gödel as well, caused a tremendous revolution in David Hilbert's whole formalism program was ditched after Gödel. So here are these guys who you would think are the center players in their field, and they felt marginalized. Why? Because of the meta-interpretations that they gave their discoveries. Both of them were committed realists. Einstein was committed to physics being descriptive of objective reality. Gödel was committed to mathematics being descriptive of objective reality. They were both super realists, and in their particular day, that wasn't fashionable. So I think that had a lot to do with why they clung to each other. Their personalities were completely different, and that's why also people wondered about it. And people I spoke to say, Einstein was very sane and non-neurotic and sage and kind of philosophical in that sort of popular sense of the word, you know. And Gödel was a neurotic, you know, and very mistrustful of everybody and of common sense, and yet on the meta level there was complete agreement between them, and so I think that's what cemented that relationship. But people still wonder, and you know, of course, it would be the conversation I would most want to listen to. I should say, I did get to meet Gödel once. He was, by the time I was at Princeton, he was a recluse, and nobody could really get to him. But he had a window, a short. I shouldn't say that. I mean, there were people that he spoke to that and he sort of kept up with. Keeping up with the field. There are certain people that I spoke to that he wanted to know what are the newest developments in logic and would keep up with. But in general, he was reclusive, sadly so, and how long he spoke to quite a lot. But there was this brief period of sociability, lasted about 3 months, and I was fortunate enough to be at a party at the Institute for Advanced Study for newcomers. And there was Kurt Godel, right? And it was, you know, it was amazing. And he was sort of, we young logicians were surrounding him. And he was very courtly and old world and gracious. But we were all tongue-tied, you know. And after he left, you know, he wished us all luck in our future research. After he left, you know, we all bemoaned the fact that we were too, you know, shy to ask him a question. And the question I most wanted to ask him, and wish to this day I had asked him, although now I think I know how he would answer, is what did he think of that John Lucas argument claiming that the implications of his theorems is that our minds can't be computers? Did he buy that? Did he think it had such implications? But I was too young and too shy to ask him. So.
We're running on. Can we take this one guy up here? We have to do. We're getting.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Dr. Goldstein, am I correct in thinking that Gödel's theorems deal with mathematical statements that are self-referential? I mean, it seems like these are, you know, mathematical statements that are saying something about themselves.
Yes.
And you know, as you were presenting this, I was struck by other systems outside of mathematics that deal with, you know, self-referential statements. Ordinary human language, you know, DNA is an information-containing molecule that says something about itself. And I think you've just kind of touched on this with the John Lucas argument, but could you speak to what kind of implications and applications there might be for Gödel's theorems beyond mathematics?
So yes, first of all, you know, you're absolutely right that the meta-mathematical, what these propositions are cooked up so that they're speaking both within the system and outside of the system. It's incredible, right? And that meta-mathematical statement is self-referential. It's talking about itself. It's cooked up in such a way so that what it is actually saying under that interpretation is that it itself is unprovable. So it has that self-referential aspect to it, though it also has a straightforward arithmetical interpretation. And as I had mentioned in the answer to another question, he had said that, you know, just straightforward mathematical propositions like Goldbach's conjecture could be also of this sort. Oh, and one of the things also, there are certain things which are true but unprovable in the system, and one of them is this statement of the consistency of the system itself. That is also, if it's true, it's unprovable. If you can prove the consistency of a system, it's inconsistent, right? That's what that means, right? If you've gone and you've proved the consistency of a system rich enough to express arithmetic, I keep adding that proviso because Gödel himself in his PhD dissertation had proved the consistency and the completeness of what we call predicate logic, which is not a rich enough system to express arithmetic. So there are systems in logic which are consistent and which are complete, and ironically enough, it was Kurt Godel who proved that, right? So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, so consistency itself is something that you can't prove within the system. What the implications are beyond mathematics is, first of all, it seems to tell us something about mathematics itself, which is something, it's about mathematics. It's in philosophy of mathematics. It seems to tell us something about our knowledge of mathematics, that we have knowledge of mathematics that can't be formalized. It seems to tell us that we have to rely on intuitions, that intuitions can't be eliminated from mathematics. This is all very interesting about mathematics. It might also tell us something, about the human mind, what the capacities of the human mind is. Maybe. I'm much less comfortable with the Penrose argument, the Lucas argument, that from Gödel's theorems we can actually prove that the mind is not a digital computer. Gödel himself shied away from this. There is one place in which Hao Wang, who was a logician who got 3 books out of his conversations with Kurt Godel. He persisted, he tracked him down, and he spoke to him, and he interviewed him a great deal. And there are 3 books in which he talks about Gödel's ideas. And what Gödel says about this argument, do his theorems show that we are not computers? Our minds, what we do in mathematics cannot be duplicated by a computer. He answered very, very interestingly. He answered with a disjunction. He said, either it shows that, or we don't have the mathematical knowledge that we think we have. We may not have this mathematical knowledge that escapes formalization, and that we can't actually prove that we do have that knowledge that escapes formal proof, because it escapes formal proof. So he answered with this kind of disjunction. What he sort of was saying was, either we're not computers, or we're computers with delusions of mathematical grandeur. Right? We may, and that, so it doesn't quite fall, and I'm happy with that answer. If that was good enough for Gödel, that's good enough for me, that disjunction.
Rebecca, we better wrap.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, thank you. I know less than the normal 25-year-old because I had been trained to dismiss all such questions as so much froth, so much fluff, so much meaninglessness. And so it put me into the state of thinking, what is it like when a person to whom these ideas, Platonism, Gödel, quantum interpretations of quantum mechanics, all of this, is the center of their life. What does that do to their life, to the other things, the other concerns? And that's when I couldn't write about that as a philosopher because my first class training kicked right in, and the methodology itself didn't allow me to ask it in sort of the free way that I wanted to ask it, and I could only do it in a novel. And so that's how I wrote that first novel. And that's always been an interest with me, this question of, okay, here it is. I do believe that thinking is a passion, and it is for me, it is the people that I'm interested in. It's not that there's passion on one side and thinking on the other. Thinking is a passion, it's an intoxicating passion. But what is it? So I'm interested in, thinking as it's done by people, and what does it do to their life, and what is it to be the kind of person for whom thinking is a passion. And I'm interested in looking at that in the novels, and I'm interested in, in these last 2 nonfiction books that I've done, one on Gödel and one on Spinoza, the most abstract thinkers. But what was it like to be them? What is it like to be Gödel? What was it like to be Spinoza? So ideas embedded in lives is for me very interesting. And in that regard, I think that I've become less of a serious philosopher by doing. Certainly the profession considers me to be less of a serious philosopher for doing this, for looking at this. But it is of interest to me.
Perhaps a better philosopher.
maybe a better philosopher, but that's what interests me. You know, that is what interests me. I mean, it is, after all, people who are doing this thinking. And should we care so much about these things, you know, and or not, you know, and what does it do to a life to have this as one's central concern is to me my central concern.
As you were talking early on, I thought, okay, I get this. And then as you began to
Why don't you stop when you're ahead?
my relative thinking was, this is syntactic nihilism. And so where do we go from here?
Yes.
And where I came out was, okay, the infinity of numbers sort of describe the whole idea of incompleteness. That if you can't find the end, there is no completeness, so isn't everything incomplete? And does it then really matter?
Everything isn't right, you know, and in some sense, that's the human predicament, isn't it? We are the creatures who realize that we are incomplete, that everything is incomplete, right? You know, that's what we are, right? And we're constantly trying to solve it.
To be or not to be. I mean,
Right.
so what's the
We are constantly trying to fix it. We're constantly coming up with systems that are going, in some sense, it's the beginning of philosophy, right? To try, you know, to recognize we are leaking into the universe and we're incomplete, right? And to fix it, right? And we always would come up with the systems, and we always try to fix it, and we always spring a leak. And that is, and there, you know, there's a certain poignancy, and that I guess is, to get back to that answer, I mean, I find that's poignant. You know, there's something poignant in our passion for completeness and our constant discovery that we are incomplete.
The beauty of life is in acknowledging the incompleteness in a way, and saying, here it is.
Yeah.
Let me move on.
True. But the ultimate incompleteness is that we're going to die.
Well, that's complete,
Yes.
though, in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. You know, and
I'm joking.
I mean, that is the other. Did any of you ever read this book?
Exactly.
There was this book in the 60s that we were all reading, The Denial of Death, Hans Becker. And you know, he, you know, when he was, you know, very pivotal book, right? And so, you know, he defines, you know, that he talks there that we are the animals who realize that we're animals. You know, the way I like to think about it is that, you know, we are the incomplete creatures who realize that we're incomplete, but it's the same sort of thing. And there's something tragic and beautiful. It is the source of all beauty, isn't it?
Sure it is.
Yes.
Liberating.
Yeah.
Liberating source of art, but even the attempt to overcome it is, you know,
But there's an absolute
brings much beauty.
specificity to Beethoven's mind.
Well, yeah.
It's based
Yeah.
on a formal coded
So
system.
structure is
Structure is,
seductive about
of
it.
course,
Which gets
of
beyond
course.
coded.
Yeah, structure is, and always the structure is at the heart of this beauty. I mean, it certainly has a lot to do with the beauty, right? The formal beauty, the structural beauty.
The readers will know the book.
Yeah. Was the mental illness necessary for the incompleteness theorems, or was it a result
Wow.
of the incompleteness theorems? Right, and so that's everybody I read about it said, you know, this was an amusing comment, but it never seemed to me amusing. It seemed to be very,
No, it's very, very
very,
real.
very real and very tragic and very real. But when you do read this proof, it's such an extraordinary proof. You know, it's so because it combines. One of the interesting things about Gödel is that part of it, he was so cautious and careful, and there's something like a bookkeeper there, you know, keeping track of everything, and the Gödel numbering is like it's a bookkeeper type of thing, you know, matching this, matching that. So much piffling, trivial little detail that you have to keep track of, that he had to keep track of. And then there's this sort of Alice in Wonderland kind of, you're in another world, right? It's playful. But Alice in Wonderland always reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, that there's something there. You've got these propositions speaking about themselves and, talking arithmetic, but talking about something else. Then the two things brought together are such a strange thing, and maybe you did have to have a something, I mean, not everybody could. Yeah, it's not just the brilliance. There's something always that gets me when I read through that proof that's so unsettling. Actually, there's something unsettling. It's both beautiful, moving, and unsettling. But anyway, yeah, so his mental illness fascinates me. The other aspect that fascinates me about him is that he had, like Spinoza, I mean, it's interesting that Einstein and Gödel, who were such legendary friends, were both, when asked to describe that philosophical outlook, went back to the 17th century rationalist, which mind-obsessed, right? So Einstein described himself as a Spinozist, and Gödel described himself as a Leibnizian. So these were these two 17th century, yeah. So it's fascinating, actually, that they both, their closest allies besides each other, were in the 17th century of the rationals. And Gödel, I found in the Nachlass, this incredible resource at Princeton, because he saved everything. So there was this little card, a little index card, which he wrote in German, his 14 principles, the things that he most believed in. And the first one was, Die Welt ist vernünftig, the world is intelligible, right? That this notion that there's always an explanation, or what Leibniz called the principle of sufficient reason. And that's very interesting also because it also shaded into his particular form that his mental illness took, which was paranoia. And he always, people I spoke to, and also from people who wrote about him, he always had an explanation for everything. Everything had an explanation, but sometimes this took very paranoid form, so that, and that psychiatrists whom I spoke to said that, in some sense, paranoia is rationality run amok, that there's always an explanation, there's always, and Oscar Morgenstern, a great economist and game theorist who was also a confidant of Gödel there at the Institute, wrote in his journal, that I speak to Gödel, he sees plots everywhere. There are always plots. There's always an explanation. So that also just sort of interests me that in these various aspects in which the genius also shades off into the mental illness. I'm not an advocate of the view that all geniuses are mad, or that one must be mad to be a genius. Einstein certainly was not, and many were not, but many are. Yeah, right. And the interesting thing also with Gödel, getting back to Gödel, is that he was right. Everybody did misinterpret. Almost everybody did misinterpret his incompleteness theorems. He, passionate Platonist that he is, right? He wants to audaciously discover mathematical proof that will, have this implication, and then everybody interprets it as, there's uncertainty, and there's relativity, and there's incompleteness, and everything's subjective, there's no objective truth, and it's all one big postmodern free-for-all, right? Exactly, or he's interpreted as a positivist. Still people will say that this was the greatest outcome of the Vienna positivist, the circle of logical positivism. Quite the opposite. Again, he hated positivism, right? Positivists believed that all mathematics is syntactical, right? That he hated this. He wanted to, in fact, prove the exact opposite. So and just as we would say in the 60s, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, right? I mean, they just, which is very funny because the book is being translated right now into Chinese, and I get the funniest, the two translations of my Gödel book that have given me the most trouble were the Germans. And the German was because I translated all this German stuff into English, and they didn't want to translate my translation back into German, so they wanted the original. But I was no longer living in Princeton, so it was very, very hard for me to get the original for them. So they gave me a lot of trouble. And the Chinese is so interesting because so, for example, this last part when I say just because, as we used to say in the 60s, right? So he writes to me and he says, I don't understand. Are you saying that because Gödel is an old man in his 60s that he was paranoid? So, fortunately, I can't read Chinese and see how this book is going to turn out. The math is no trouble, right? It's the rest of the stuff.
Do you have any recordable contact with Wittgenstein?
Oh, fascinating question. Fascinating question. So Wittgenstein was the reigning god of the logical positivists. I mean, it's really very, very interesting how they worship this man. They know Schlick and they worship this man and this guy Weissman. It was just, this guy Weissman would begin every, he was writing a book on the Tractatus, I think on Wittgenstein's views on mathematics. And he would report at every meeting of the Vienna Circle, the Schlick Circle. He would begin with reporting the latest changes in Wittgenstein's ideas are this. Although Wittgenstein has renounced responsibility for my transmission of them, and then they took him so seriously that some philosophers in Vienna theorized that there really was no Dr. Wittgenstein, that this was a figment of Schlick's imagination to give them some gravitas, right? But anyway, but they really, and then they spent 2 years reading the Tractatus, which argues that all mathematics is syntactical. And they read it the way you always think. 9 out of the 14 of them were Jewish, of the logical positivists, and although of course they were not believing, all theism is certainly meaningless, right, by logical standards. What was it?
Kabbalah or something?
It's almost the way, it's reminding me, the way they studied and read and discussed the Tractatus, the way Jews read the Torah portion every week, right? And you read and you go through in the whole year and you manage to finish it. And it really reminded me of the way, reading Parsha HaShavua, right? Reading the Torah portion of the week. And so Wittgenstein's a real god there. And my fear, and very few of them were allowed to meet with him. Schlick was allowed to, and Weissman was allowed to, and then Carnap asked too many questions, and he was banished, and then Feigl liked Carnap too much, so that Wittgenstein got angry at Feigl, and he wouldn't let him. He's a real prima donna. And I think that Gödel, Platonist among the positivists that he was, right, was pissed as all hell at the worship of Wittgenstein, and I think he never met Wittgenstein, but he has various, again, down there in the Nachlass, he didn't send them off, angry letters about Wittgenstein, and so Wittgenstein in Foundations of Mathematics talks a lot about Gödel and says that Gödel couldn't possibly prove what he calls it logical magic tricks, and he really kind of denigrates them. And Wittgenstein, and Gödel reacts to this and sends a very angry letter. He sends a very angry letter to Karl Menger, as a matter of fact, so that Eve's father, and so I think that in fact, actually I say in the book that each of them were thorns deep in each other's meta-mathematics, neither of them could accept the other's views. So I think that Wittgenstein plays an important role, but it's as a kind of goad. But there's very little evidence for this.
Last question, or
Yeah.
So, what are we looking forward to in your career?
Yes. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I'm working on a new novel. And so the last book was about Spinoza, and actually both of those last nonfiction books I was asked to write. They were both appeared in series. One, the Gödel book, appeared in the Norton series on great scientific discoveries, and they simply came to me and they said, who do you want to write about? Both of these series wanted people who knew how to write, who knew how to tell a story. This is the new thing with abstract ideas, to put it into a narrative frame. And so that's what both of these series were looking for. And so it was very easy when Norton asked me to write about some great scientific discovery that I wanted to do Gödel. I mean, I've been obsessed with Gödel since I met him when I was 23. And didn't ask him the question I wanted to ask him. And one of the reasons I called it Betraying Spinoza was that I do look at Spinoza in a way that I've never looked at him before, and that goes against my philosophical training, certainly goes against Spinoza's philosophy. I look at him as coming out of that Jewish history, that particular community, which was an extraordinary community. And I actually see, the interesting thing that happened was that I saw his philosophy. I've taught Spinoza since I was 26 years old. I mean, I think I understand that system inside out. I actually saw the system changing as I looked at it from that historical perspective, looked at it from the viewpoint of Jewish history, and saw it as very much a kind of rethinking of what personal identity is, and because of his community's obsessions with identity and Jewish identity and what's essential to being a person, whether his Jewishness was essential. He argues it isn't, it can't be, but it gives it, so the whole slant changed. But it got me very interested in this whole science, religion, controversy that was so intense in the 17th century. It was pre-Enlightenment, but I really do believe that Spinoza had a lot to do with creating the Enlightenment, that he really, in thinking his way out of Jewish history and ultimately trying to solve the problem that he felt very keenly of Jewish suffering, this historic suffering that he himself witnessed, that these were refugees from the worst Jewish calamity of that time, the Portuguese Spanish Inquisition, that he thought his way into this, universalism, this secularism, and he was bashed, once he was excommunicated by the Jews. He was attacked by all of Europe, of Christian Europe, but just this war between science and religion and faith and reason, and look how they were slugging it out in the 17th century. And then I pick my head up out of the 17th century and I look at what's going on right now in the world and in America, and the separation of church and state, and it's like, oh, I thought we solved these problems. I thought Spinoza showed us the way, and there it was. And that seemed to me fascinating, that somehow these issues are centered. They're once again. So I'm writing a novel about that. That's a very long answer to your question.